introduction, and I posted on Facebook. I said thank you to the grad students, and everybody I met has been really amazing. And I came because I knew I was going to learn a lot, and so it is true. I have a few caveats to start, which is I was on a red eye, not last night but the night before. I am on California time, and I didn't skip the morning because I wanted to hear the papers. So if this in fact seems a little disjointed, it is probably because it is, and I didn't have the time to run through it and see if the flow works and so on. That was a choice I made to learn some new material. And the other caveat is that Mika asked me a couple weeks ago what I was going to talk about, and I said, okay, and violence and environmentalism. So, you know, it's not a talk I've given before, so it's not like totally fleshed out. So, but I'm excited to give it nonetheless. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what I've been doing. First of all, that I started working on environmental justice as an undergrad when I was 20, and I took a class on race, poverty, and environment, and I was involved in campus activism. There were undergraduate and graduate students at UC Berkeley that were really interested in environmental justice. And Michigan is also one of those special places where you have that kind of cluster of students, both undergraduate and graduate, and faculty who work on these issues. And so, even though it's been a long time, I really think of myself from coming intellectually and personally to this material, and it's been a while now. So this is kind of the three areas that I've done the most chunk of work in. Noxious New York on environmental justice activism in New York City, which was my, I was an organizer in New York. I was, and this was my dissertation. 25 Stories is a project I'll talk about a little bit. And I did basically a cluster of work with a number of colleagues around environmental inequalities in the Central Valley. And again, these places are really, really different. Yet I was surprised to find that asthma was a very big issue in both. And so a lot of times people think of asthma as like an urban problem, you know, it's a Black and Latino like housing, you know, related. It's a big problem in Detroit, New York, LA, etc. And then when I went to the Central Valley, I found that asthma was like a huge thing. And some of the worst rates of air quality and air pollution are in these tiny towns in the Central Valley. And so, which kind of relates to the third project, which I just finished on an eco-city in China. And so, you know, I put this up not to sort of brag and say, oh, look, I've done all this research in all these different places. But usually, I do this because what I think, even though these seem like really different projects, what kind of underlies them is exactly the theme of your conference, you know, which is borders and crossings and how these ideas kind of cross space and time. And I've always been really interested in the politics of place, race, power, and space, and kind of how discourses and movements kind of work through these other forces at work. And so I really appreciate the framing of your conference as being both very broad and also allowing for the, again, detailed, you know, empirical work, however you do it. So with that, let me turn now to what. Okay, so as you all know, environmental justice is a global movement. It also has very specific U.S. context, and some of this has come up in different, you know, talks already. You know, toxic waste and race. There was a report on toxic waste and race at 20. And so kind of the original language of environmental justice, though, of course, you know, the things that were named by environmental justice are way, way older than that, but the movement was named in the 1980s in response to documentation of environmental racism. And, you know, scholars like Rosita Taylor and Bunyan Bryant, you know, people at University of Michigan are key in that generation of research. The relationship has always been social movements first, and then, you know, policy development and theorizing afterwards. And so, kind of in response to the research and activism, there's been a set of public policies that have been generated around this, both at state level and federal level. I'm sure this is pretty basic to most of you, but I figure it's worth just doing a general, everybody has like their general environmental justice overview slide. So this is mine. And then, it's an interdisciplinary academic field. So roots in quantitative sociology, the law, policy, but now into geography, public health, literary studies, cultural studies, etc. And my approach to this set, and again, it's very diverse issues and populations, and you can see this in the papers that have been presented today. I was listening to a paper today about, Bhopal, or, the waste dumping in West Africa, or Navajo uranium mining, or, so it's a whole set of different issues, all under this kind of frame of rubric of environmental justice. It's urban, it's rural, it's racial, it's indigenous, it's gendered, etc. And so you have a really interesting thing that's happened in the last 20, 30 years in terms of the way that the term environmental justice has been a force to name a lot of different diverse sets of issues and conflicts. And of course, there's a really complicated and important link between environmental justice and climate justice, which I'm not really going to talk about today, but just to flag out for people. But the point for me always is that, in my view, the research follows the activism. And so what we do is, we work with activists and activist discourse, and this activism also is theory. There's theorization that comes in the activism itself. And so those are kind of my caveats in terms of how I do my work. In terms of where environmental justice research is going, I think there's really interesting work by Laura Pulido. Laura Pulido always does interesting work, but she's publishing interesting work now about racial capitalism and the role of the racial environmental state. Is some work that Keith Miyake, who's working with me at UC Davis, he had done his PhD with Ruby Gilmore, who does prison work, prison environmental justice. And then David Pello is starting to publish on critical environmental justice studies. So this is like my little snapshot, of where I think the really cool environmental justice work is right now. And then another question that I'm trying to work through right now, I'm not sure. I wanted to just pose it out there. Part of why you give papers and talk about things is, to kind of get it out into your head and get it out into the world and say, okay, well, what do you think of this? And it's always a very, it's not finished and fleshed out for me, but this is kind of one of the things that I'm interested in right now, in part because I want to think about how these different moments, these different struggles, these different social movements and problems are related. Because for me, I always do really research on a thing, and I research that thing. But those things are always connected to each other, even though others may not see the connection. The other reason I did that slide in my three, areas of research I've done was that sometimes people ask me, like they know me in one way, and they don't even know I did this other thing. So I went to an Asian studies event once for the Fantasy Island book. They had no idea I did environmental justice at all. And I had an audience of one person. And so for me, those things are related. You can't talk about sustainability discourse in eco-cities without also talking about environmental justice. Those separations make no sense to me. It's hard to theorize like a bigger connection. So that's kind of where I'm at intellectually. I'm hoping that naming this question will help me as well. So that was part of the reason I said yes. I was like, oh, this is a big conference with big ideas and big connections, and it'll help me, in that process. And so again, just to emphasize, I think activism is theorizing. My research comes out of the activism, but theory also helps with practice and vice versa. So for me, there isn't really a separation between those things. I also have always been really obsessed with crossing borders in all other kinds of ways, and that includes intellectual borders between fields. And I've always really been interested in how toxicity crosses borders. I did early work on diethylstilbestrol and toxic bodies. So what I'm going to present about in some way is going back to a very early piece I wrote about toxicity. And of course, borders has a political manifestation as well. So this comes out of a lot of theorizing, not in environmental studies or environmental justice, but around immigration, migration, globalization, etc. So in terms of what violence and environmental racism, I thought it was a suitably large enough frame that I could talk about two of the three things I wanted to talk about. But I think, so I'm going to talk today about Central Valley and prison and pesticide pollution link, and two, urban, racial, and spatial violence, pollution, Black Lives Matter, police violence, and gentrification. So I hope these are big enough ideas. And then the third, I'm not talking at all, but I think it's like the most important thing that's happening, or one of, and so that's it. That I'm not going to talk about the third, but I think it's related. Maybe people can help me understand how it's related. But since I haven't really done research on the third, obviously I can't talk about it. But it's very, very. It seems like a very important moment. So let me get to the first. Environmental racism as premature death in the Central Valley. And I don't remember which paper was talking about premature death, and there was a talk about the last paper was on disposability and so on. And it's worth remembering the role of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and her writing in Golden Gulag. And for those of you who don't know this book, she's basically a Marxist geographer who writes about the rise of the prison system in the Central Valley region of California. And she talks about the explosive growth in prisons in the Central Valley in the 1980s and 1990s as a spatial and racial fix to crisis. And so basically, in the 80s and 90s, like a huge number of prisons were built in the Central Valley. That's the kind of demographic policy fact. And then she's trying to explain why and how that came to be. And in that book, she defines racism as the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, which to me seems as good a working definition of racism as any I've come across. And so, I put this also, A, to just say, if you haven't read the book, you should read it, and B, that this definition of racism to me is, for me, the most useful one. And that term, premature, just to keep that term in your head, and I'll return to it, group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So the first example, again, of Central Valley prisons, pesticides, and pollution. They are linked, of course, because the Central Valley is, as I just described, is the site of an incredible concentration of prison building. It is also an incredible site of pesticide use and pollution. And there's an environmental, geological reason why the pollution is really bad in the Central Valley, like why the worst air quality is found in these tiny towns in the Central Valley, and not as you would guess, most people would guess, in places like New York or LA. And it has to do with the structure of the Central Valley and the mountains capturing the air and so on. But of course it has to do with the landscape of the Central Valley itself, which is an industrialized agricultural landscape that is meant to maximize production and so on. So what I want to, and there's been a huge amount of work on the Central Valley and labor exploitation and farmable organizing and so on. So, obviously this is a lot of, I'm building off of a lot of other people's work. But just to give you a little bit more of a focal point, this was one of the images I used to show, represent my Central Valley engagement. And I talked about this project in the graduate student forum yesterday. This was, it's the same image. This image was taken by a graduate student I worked with named Tracy Perkins in community development, who's now an assistant professor at Howard. And she wrote a dissertation that was looking at gender and politicization in the Central Valley. And she was really interested in this question, if you know the Lois Gibbs case, the whole narrative of Lois Gibbs is, oh, she's a white housewife, she found out her home was on this polluted chemical thing, and then Lois Gibbs becomes this kind of signal moment of environmental knowledge and activism. It's kind of like Silent Spring, but of course the story is way more complicated. There's an environmental historian named Elizabeth Plum who wrote a book about Love Canal, which actually looks much more deeply at race, class, and gender, African American women in public housing. There's the role of the religious organizations. But the point is that the narrative in people's heads is about Lois Gibbs. and you could say Erin Brockovich, kind of like woman, working class, white woman, kind of coming to voice, and I wasn't politicized, but now I am because of my child's harm, etc. That's the narrative. And so she was really interested in, is that true? Is that narrative true for environmental justice activists in the Central Valley? Is that how women become political around environmental justice? And she did a bunch of interviews, she took a bunch of photos, took life stories, and so on. In the grad seminar lunch I had yesterday, I said, well, actually, I totally disagree with her, because Tracy's answer is no, gender has nothing to do with it. I think it does, but it's her thesis, and it's not my role to be like, you're wrong, because I think qualitative sociology is limited. That wasn't my role to do that, And so I was on her committee, and I was like, cool, you wrote a good thesis, and she was interested in this public dimension. I collected these incredible stories and so on. So I said, okay, well, let's do something with it, So we did, so this is an example, picture of the photo exhibit. It's actually online. We developed a teaching curriculum, so people can use it in their classes. It's not, it used to be at 25 Stories of the Central Valley, but right now it's housed on her own website called Voices from the Valley, right there. And part of why I do this is because I'm also still invested in that story and that project, and part of the issue, of course, with environmental justice activists is that they're often overburdened in terms of telling their story. They're often not compensated, et cetera, et cetera. So part of this is like, how can we use technology to kind of share the story? How can we teach it, et cetera? That's a long, roundabout description of this. Teresa de Anda is a pesticide drift activist, and she died a couple years ago from a very rare form of cancer. Her family believes that it was because of pesticide exposure. She is standing her house is right there. That's a field. The pesticide drift problem is that pesticide drifts. And there's a huge amount of aerial pesticides that are used in the Central Valley. And, of course, the concentration of pesticides usage in California is very disproportionate. So 2% of the agricultural farmland is in this Central Valley region, yet the Central Valley uses 25% of the nation's pesticides. So, and it's sprayed. Like there are, the first time John probably grew up and it was normal, but the first time I was driving, and this low flying crop came, over the highway, I was like, what's happening with that? But they go like that, they do aerial spray, and then sometimes the wind blows it, and it blows over, it goes from the fields to homes, huge and very, very toxic stuff. If you really want to read the book to read about this is Pesticide Drift by Jill Harrison. And very damaging, horrific pesticide drift poisonings, where entire towns get basically sprayed with this stuff. There was her town in Early Mart in 1998 had a very, very huge pesticide drift case where like 200 people, mostly Latino farm workers, had to go to the hospital. They had no people who could speak Spanish. They were stripped down naked and sprayed with water. This is like not 1933. We're not talking Bracero program. This is 1998. Because of the work of Teresa and other anti-pesticide drift activists, there has been some legislation passed on this issue. My point again is, this is a political problem. And there are activists who have been working for a very long time on it. And my little role in this is to sort of get the stories out. So again, the question of what can we as humanists or people in the humanities do? I think stories are really an important part of that. So that's the kind of one of the examples for I think struggles for justice, of course, but also recognition. Recognition culturally, recognition visibly, and so on. And you can see this in another one of her photos. This is a Sandra Meraz, who was the first Native and Latina woman named to the water board. And not to get into the details, but basically you might know that California has a huge water issue, including a drought. I was joking, I said, taking a long shower in Michigan is so nice, I don't feel bad about being in there. But there are huge water access issues even before the drought. So there are many, many small towns that are not hooked up to water systems. And so, I heard a couple of papers on Flint yesterday, and there are people who've been saying, well, in some of these towns in the Central Valley, they've been buying all their water all the time because they're not even connected to the system. Their water is poisoned by the nitrates for the people who aren't connected to systems. And there are thousands of people in the Central Valley who actually don't have access to water. Mm-hmm. Like you can't open a tap and get your water. You have to go buy the water for everything you do. So the situation in Flint, like you buy it to bathe, to cook, all that stuff. That is a permanent condition for thousands of people in the Central Valley, and that's, Sandra Mraz buying that. For those of you who don't know the water governance issues in the Central Valley, basically water is governed by these very, very powerful water districts, and they are not tied to municipalities. And it has nothing to do with how many people are in the town or whatever. Water is governed by water districts that are based on land ownership. So the Westland Water District controls like almost all the water in the Southern San Joaquin. And before Sandra Mraz, who had been an environmental justice water activist for a long time, was named to it, there had never been someone who didn't represent Big Ag on a water district. So that's a political recognition, being on this water district. But this photo I think also represents the storytelling component of connecting this very big policy thing that I just tried to summarize in 1 minute to a photo of her kind of daily practice of getting water to live. And so I think the struggle for environmental justice is political, in terms of, getting better legislation about pesticide drift, getting legislation for water access, getting access to small water systems being put in, and so on. But it's also a cultural project of recognition that these stories of injustice are here, and they are, they have been for a long time. This is another photo, not from her, Tracy's project, of environmental justice for Community Water Center in Sana de Anda, and they're organizing. And in California now has passed a legislation for the human right to water. California, because of the activists, has passed a significant number of environmental justice related legislation, continued fights about what that means and how well it's implemented. But again, that goes back to my original slide about my view of environmental justice is it's a cultural movement, it's about social movements create policy, and then these things are all connected. So people who think about policy but don't think about the cultural implications of it, like those definitions have never made sense to me. And they don't make sense to the activists themselves. Those separations are bureaucratic, they're ideological, and so on. And so collapsing those borders between practice and activism and the academy, or collapsing the borders between these domains like water and pesticides, prisons and pesticides. That's not how the activists make sense of the world around them. It's the bureaucratic logic that says prisons are different than pesticides. Well, the Central Valley environmental justice activists talk about them together. So why do we as scholars, we should also talk about them together. It doesn't make sense to say, well, that crime is here and pesticides are here. No, that's not true. Okay, and as I said before, there is a long history of activists working on farm worker activism against pesticides and reproductive impacts. This is all a prequel to get to the actual work that I did, because I didn't do the pesticide drift work. I didn't do the 25 stories work. I try in the ways that I can to support that scholarship as well. So my example that I'm going to talk about is the cleft palate controversy in Kettleman City. Just some of you not about, so some of you are familiar with it, but just to make sure everybody knows what it was. Oh wait, that's not it. So the Kettleman City birth palate controversy happened about 8 years ago. And basically, Kettleman City is a small town in the Central Valley. For those of you who know the history of environmental justice activism, you often hear about Warren County, North Carolina, and the organizing against a PCB facility. The other kind of iconic, start in the environmental justice movement is often Kettleman City, and there's a big waste facility. It's the largest PCB facility west of the Mississippi. So in 2008, there were a cluster of cleft palate births. And it's a very small town. So I'm going to skip now and then read this part, because I wrote this a couple of years ago and I haven't looked at it, so you're going to have to just bear with me. So the Kettleman City birth palate controversy has to be understood within the larger context of activism in the Central Valley, both environmental justice and broader social movements as well, in what sociologist Daniel Faber calls the polluter industrial complex. I already talked about Ricky Gilmore and her argument about the development of prisons as kind of a rural spatial fix to economic and racial crisis in California in the 1980s and 1990s. Her argument is that the expansion of prisons in the Central Valley is a way to manage several racial and economic crises in California. The prisons, which house overwhelmingly African American and Latino urban populations from the Los Angeles and Bay Area, are cited in the Central Valley in part as a rural economic development and jobs program. And she also traces the history of the places where the prisons are cited in their, a lot of those places are where the South, there was a southern move for cotton in the 1930s, so there's a broader history there as well. The Central Valley region, and particularly the southern San Joaquin Valley, and Kettleman City. So if you go Central Valley, then southern San Joaquin, then Kettleman City. They're all highly stratified societies with extreme racial and economic inequalities that are shaped by social location, primarily race, class, and immigration status. So the land use is racialized in the sense that the economic structure of the valley creates gross disparities of pollution exposure and lack of access to environmental amenities. For example, in the case of water that I talked about before. Again, this region is the site of the most productive agricultural region in the world. It's 2% of the nation's farmland but uses 25% of the nation's pesticides. And 90% of the pesticides used there are vulnerable to pesticide drift. Again, when the chemicals drift off the field with disastrous health consequences for local communities. The social and environmental conditions of the Central Valley, the highest rates of air pollution, the high risk from water contamination, carceral landscapes, high poverty, and high residential foreclosure rates, and low educational attainment are not accidental, but in fact are structural. The region, of course, is home to a long and radical farm worker and activist tradition dating back over 100 years. Personified, we know about Cesar Chavez, but also Larry Ideolog and so on. And much of the early pioneering health activism and legal work around farm worker protection was focused on birth defects, specifically the negative health effects of pesticides on maternal and fetal health. So, I say this to just give you the broader context of the cleft palate, struggle. So you can't look at cleft palate without understanding all of this history, is what I'm saying. Which in this group you probably agree to, but there are many places where that is not understood to be relevant. There are a lot of places where people are like, so what? Who cares? Farm worker pesticide exposure is a persistent racialized and gendered problem in the sense that agricultural workers are majority people of color. In many poor Central Valley communities, the divide between workplace, I showed you the field, and the housing is non-existent. It's an irrelevant divide between work and home. Hence the problem of the drift. There's no meaningful separation between work and housing. Just as in Love Canal, there was no meaningful separation between the industrial space and the housing development. So this lack of clear boundaries and separation is also a powerful, it's a reality that has material consequences, but it's also a powerful metaphor, I think, for the lack of meaningful boundaries between mother and child during pregnancy, and kind of that crossing of boundary as well. Housewives are a well-known possible constituency opposing industrial facilities. We just heard the quote, that famous what's his name, Lawrence, whatever, about Lawrence Summers' quote about where polluting should go globally. In 1984, there was, of course, many of you know the Searle report, that talked about rural, low-income, less education, and Catholic as the factors that would say communities that are more accepting of polluting facilities. And it stated, this is a quote from the Sarah report, one occupational classification that has consistently demonstrated itself as a strong indicator of opposition to the siting of noxious facilities is housewives, end quote. Again, you know, there's a broad, longer history of housewife, you know, discourse and maternalism. So the focus on reproductive health and its interconnections with environmental justice is an example of gendered relationship to place and bodies that is a racialized feature of what I call racialized transcorporeality. And so for those of you, of course, many of you in this room already know Stacey Alimo's work on transcorporeality, but for those of you who don't, there's this literary scholar who wrote a book, and she names this thing that many of us had kind of intuitively knew, but because she names it, it's associated with her. And she says that transcorporeality is that, quote, the human is always the very messy stuff, is the very stuff of the messy, contingent, emergent mix of the material world. The body is enmeshed in social and material systems and systems of domination. They're enacted in individual and community bodies, cultural representations, and modes of knowing and thinking, end quote. So, like the Ruth Gilmore quote about racism, that quote is a useful like summary of a whole lot of thinking and activism around, you know, this stuff that we're talking about here at this symposium. And so that's why many of us cite Alimo. And so what I try to do in this work on Kettleman City is say, yes, this Kettleman City is transcorporeality, but it's racialized in a very particular way, and it's gender. Environmental justice research has begun to take gender more seriously as a category of analysis, although in not reductionist or biologically essentialist ways. And so Kettleman City activists signify a return to the early activism of farm worker environmental justice folks, gendered through human reproduction as well as shaped by social and political forces that harm particular bodies, those of working class, women of color, through their elevated exposure to toxic chemicals and pesticides in the fields and in their homes. And so, while the well-worn narrative of activism triggered by motherhood deserves critique, it deserves analysis, the Kettleman City case shows how the discourses and experiences of motherhood, environmental exposure, and protection are differentially located racially. White women and women of color occupy different relationships to motherhood discourses, and with environmental pollution specifically, especially as their race and gender intersect with class, citizenship, geographic, and social location. Whereas white middle-class motherhood is presumed innocent, and their children deserving of environmental protection from the state, for working class women of color or undocumented women in the fields, coming from a socially and regionally disenfranchised location, the presumption of childhood innocence is always a fraught political project. So while a critique of motherhood environmental politicization narrative may be necessary, as my student argued, the claiming of motherhood from the Kettleman City activists belies and complicates that critique. The Kettleman City motherhood was the Kettleman City mothers who are arguing against the cleft palate, against the state, against the cleft palate births, are not claiming motherhood in the same way that Lois Gibbs claims motherhood. They're operating in a highly charged and racialized anti-immigrant context. Their claims to motherhood are not predicated on biology and innocence, but on a critique of racialized exposure. And their racialized transcorporeality is not exceptional, but exemplifies an important strand of environmental justice and reproductive justice activism. There's lots of places where this, I think, racialized transcorporeality exists. Some of you know about the Arctic native breast milk contamination, Asian and Latina immigrant occupational exposures from garment work, computer production, or nail salons. And these all exemplify the racialized and gendered ways in which transcorporeality is lived and experienced. In other words, while transcorporeality is a broad condition of contemporary life, the particular economic and environmental conditions for women of color and indigenous women ensure that they suffer the particular burdens worse from the global toxic production system. the question here is not whether or not populations choose the conditions of their life and labor. Rather, the racialized dimensions of transcorporeality necessitate particular burdens on their bodies. These racialized and gendered bodies have reproductive consequences that lay bare the brutalities of the current economic environmental system, and it's overlaid always with histories of domination and violence. Just to go back to this, the anti-pesticide organizing in the United Farm Workers in the 1960s was racialized and gendered, and there's an important history of the breast milk contamination as being the focal point of a lot of the early lawsuits that were used. This CRLA, I forget what it stands for now. Does anyone, I'm like totally blanking out. It's not Center for Race Farm Environment. They basically, Ralph Abascal, who's the lead attorney, used a lot of the data about 6 farm worker women who had DDT in their breast milk. And that was the grounds for the legal case that basically ends DDT. Okay. So my point here is to just say, okay, well, there's a broad, long history that, there's a lot written about CRLA in this lawsuit and, this work, but to really draw out the racialized transcorporeality and breast milk contamination from this perspective, I think is important. So they here it is, California Rural Legal Assistance filed a 1969 lawsuit on behalf of 6 farm workers, 5 of the 6 were nursing mothers. And they argued that because DDT accumulates in the breast milk, that produces particular types of harm. And so basically their lawsuit led to the banning of DDT. They continued this fight, CRLA, for 20-something years, leading 20 years later to the EPA banning 85% of the pesticides that were then in use. So again, this, I think, I just want to emphasize always, for me, the activism and the discourse and the theory, they're deeply connected. You can't study this stuff outside of the world in which people are living and fighting. Pesticide exposure in farm workers and the impact of this exposure on developing fetuses remains a problem now. And there's still legislation and activism around this in the Central Valley. And so maternal pesticide exposure is not only an iconic story in the history of environmental justice activism, arguably as important as the Warren County and the Cattleman City cases. It's a powerful example of racialized transcorporeality where human and social systems are intermixed with systems of political domination. So, where have I gotten to? I'm getting to Cattleman City. So Cattleman City is a small and predominantly farm worker Latino community that faces a lot of problems, environmental problems. It's the site of the major hazardous waste facility, the largest west of the Mississippi. In the last 8 years, there's been a lot of focus on Cattleman City, renewed focus because of the facility was looking to expand. So basically, if you've read about, if you've read Owen Foster's History of Environmental Justice Activism, they were fighting, community members were fighting the siting of this facility. They lost that fight, but they continued to, fight the facility and especially the expansion. And so in the last, so what happened was that there was a bunch of cleft palate births. And this is not a large community, so the numbers we're talking about are not huge. So I think there were 20 live births in the year that the palate controversy came up, and 5 out of the 10 were palate. And so by explicating how race, gender, and environment are interlinked, I suggest that environmental and reproductive injustices are intimately connected. And racialized images of motherhood and childbirth are a central component of the activist organizing in Cattleman City, specifically in counterweight to the highly technical knowledge about toxic exposures used by regulatory agencies and polluters. So again, you can't look at cleft palate, the activism around cleft palates, without understanding the history in Cattleman City, is what I'm saying. So basically, I say these things and I say, okay, I teach an intro class, so I'm like, okay, this is the only thing I really want you to know. And so, in this larger paper, I argue that the Cattleman City cleft palate controversy is an example where reproductive and environmental justice meet through racialized transcorporeality in order to denormalize the embodied toxicity operating at multiple spatial and temporal scales that include both bodily and regional. I'll skip that, anti-immigrant, anti-natalism, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so Jill Harrison, this is important. The pesticide drift book is a great book. And she really focuses on pesticide drift, the organizing, activism, policy, and science, including mainstream environmental groups and how they relate to this problem. And she talks about the seeming paradox of how pesticide poisoning is both, she calls, pervasive and invisible. Like, how can it be both at the same time? In the early Mark case, she talks about the 170 Spanish-speaking residents. They vomited in a pesticide-drift incident. They vomited, they couldn't breathe, their eyes were burning, they experienced dizziness. The emergency response personnel didn't speak Spanish and brought the residents to the school. They stripped them publicly and hosed them down. An investigation revealed that the residents were a cloud of metam sodium, a soil fumant that is a known carcinogen, was the source of that incident. And again, why do we call it an incident instead of a mass poisoning? It wasn't mass poisoning. She shows how the pesticide industry and the environmental regulatory state narrate a particular story about incidents like early Mart as both exceptional and also accidental. So again, normalized and pervasive, accidental and exceptional. Harrison's argument is that pesticide drift details the workings of raw power, and it shifts the burden of pesticide pollution to the bodies of those most marginalized and vulnerable. And so what I think is important about Harrison is that she articulates raw power and the pervasive invisibility and thus the normalization of environmental abuse on the most vulnerable populations and how they basically play themselves out in the lives and experiences of entire groups of people. So the Kettleman City cleft palate controversy is an exceptional example of how a normalized state of pervasive environmental pollution and social inequality become temporarily exposed and used by activists in ways that trigger attention from the state. So the birth defects in Kettleman City literally draw upon the visual images of toxic exposure, bodily pollution, and their impacts on babies, seen as the ultimate victims of a social and economic reality that hits particular people hard. So the cleft palate controversy, as in the case of pesticide drift, show the raw power of environmental pollution, like racism, and it's met alongside and with community resistance. Pervasive and historical patterns of pollution exposure, toxic contamination, and environmental destruction are not accidental, but instead endemic and embedded in systems of exploitation heightened in an era of neoliberalism. And so the example of the farm worker activism, the CRLI lawsuit, the Kettleman City case, they're powerful examples of the environmental justice critique of separation between bodies and environmental pollution and between work and labor, and both terms, both ways that labor is used, both biological labor and work labor, and the separation between environmental issues and between race, gender, and environmentalism as both the problem and the activism surrounding racialized transcorporeality. I want to just leave this up here. So that's the Bottling Nature's book, which has the transcorporeality, and her new book, Alenda's new book, Toxic Bodies, which talks a lot about diethylstilbestrol. And then I want to talk about the ecological other, because if those of you who don't know that book, I think it's a really important one. Sarah Jaquette Ray suggests that discourses of environmental body draw upon normative notions of body, wholeness, and health. The chapter on the early conservation movement and its link to eugenics is particularly interesting, because of the construction of wilderness and nature in the early 20th century. Her framework of ecological othering is linked, and what she is trying to do is link environmental studies, ethnic studies, and disability studies. And so I think that's really important. Another really great book is Julie Avro-Minich's Accessible Citizenship, Disability, Nation, and the Cultural Politics of Greater Mexico, and she has a Central Valley chapter in there as well. And that book talks about corporeal images, body, is used to depict national belonging. So how metaphors of the body are used to construct borders, the kind of invasion discourse, etc. And she argues that cultural representations conceptualize political belonging through images of disability. So a lot of my work recently, especially in thinking through this, is trying to take disability studies critique really seriously. And not, and again, there were a couple of talks yesterday that were talking about how to not rest upon ideas of wholeness, purity, that a lot of environmental activism and discourse relies on. How do you not do that? So on the one hand, it would be entirely possible to argue that Kettleman City mothers are relying on old tropes of virtuous motherhood that have historically strained mainstream environmental discourse. It's Lois Gibbs with Brown. Their focus on birth defects can also be read as a troubling reliance on normative and idealized healthy bodies and a return to disgust as a central mode of environmental politics. However, I don't think that's actually what's happening. Racialized transcorporeality takes gendered, racialized, and disability studies critiques into account simultaneously and intersectionally. In other words, the problem is not disgust and shame focused on the birth defects and directed at the cleft palate babies themselves, but a political critique of the social, economic, and environmental system that normalizes pollution exposure that manifests in particularly visible ways through human reproduction. So I think what the activists are trying to do, and you can see this in a lot of the quotes around the cleft palate. So what I did was I didn't actually go to a lot of the listening sections, but I read the transcripts and so on. And a lot of the quotes by the women who had cleft palate babies or environmental justice activists really focus on not the individual factors, but the systemic ones. Outdoor exposures, either through air or water, rather than their individual risks. Just to give you one of the, and a few of the cleft palate babies died. So it wasn't just that they were born, some of them born and died. One of the mothers, Daria Hernandez Lorenzo, said at one of the listening sessions, quote, "I'm here because my baby was born like this, with his little face deformed, and I'm asking you not to issue any more permits until investigation is done." So, again, it's like, yes, I'm here because of this, and I want you to do this thing. Don't tell me it's about how I was exposed. You need to do this first. The insistence on political critique and the focus on pollution as a cause for the personal tragedy is dominant. That's their frame of reference. Another one of the mothers, Magdalena Romero, said in an interview, "Kettleman City is just a pigsty, but we're human beings and we have rights." So this is one of the photos actually that Tracy Perkins took, again, in the context of the Voices from the Valley. And you can see this is a father of one of the cleft palate of Ashley who actually died. So the centrality of visual images in cleft palates and their babies is visceral. It's self-consciously intended as a political message of looking. The picture of babies are everywhere, from personal anguish, but they're also used to make political demands, and everything in between. So centralizing these images is obviously a reprise of thalidomide, and a lot of other kinds of activism. And so to give you just a brief summary, because I actually want to get to my second example, there was a study. So basically this stuff happened, the community was like, you need to study this, you need to figure out what's happening. So they ordered a study by the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Public Health. This study ruled out toxic waste as a cause. This is the quote. "Although the overall investigation found high levels of pollutants in air, water, and soil in Kettleman City, a comprehensive investigation did not find a specific cause or environmental exposure among the mothers that would explain the increase in the number of children born with birth defects in Kettleman City." The layman translation is that the pollution here is no worse than it is anywhere else. So
fuck
again,
that
think about the idea.
Sorry, just said fuck that shit.
To think about, again, how Jill Harrison's term of pervasive, normalized raw power,